Each one of us is the result of billions of years of evolution and devolution. Billions of years of actions and their consequences have led to this moment. The actions of those who lived before us gave us this body and this life. This is truly an incredible, precious gift. But what are we doing with it? How is our behavior today creating consequences for our children and their children? Sadly, our situation is very grave and is becoming increasingly threatening. We face so many immense dangers, and yet are totally unaware of the worst of them. To understand the reality of our situation, we need to understand how we got here. Only then can we understand how to truly change our lives. As is often said, those who ignore their history are certain to repeat it. Every child learns through stories. It is obvious that children's stories are not historical or literal facts. They are inventions designed to help the reader subconsciously understand basic truths. Myths and religious stories are the same. Every religion and mythological tradition tells stories about how the world was created and about our ancestors. But modern people make the mistake of interpreting those stories literally. Religions and myths are not literal. They are symbolic, and one needs to know how to interpret them. In fact, the secret mystical book of Judaism, the Zohar, says so.
The stories of the teaching are the covering of the teaching. Woe to him who takes that covering for the teaching itself. There are foolish people who, when they see a man covered with fine clothes, look no further than the clothes. And yet it is the body that lends value to the clothes, and still more precious is the soul. The teaching also has its body and soul. The simple-minded take heed of nothing but the covering, the stories of the teaching. They know nothing else, and do not see what is hidden under them. The well-informed think not of the clothes, but of the body that the story covers. Finally, the wise think of the soul only, which is the foundation of all the rest, and which is the teaching itself.
The religious stories, myths, and legends that everyone knows and interpret literally and use as the basis for their dogmas and traditions are like children's stories. They are not literal history, but are symbolic. They hide levels of meanings that the public would never imagine. For instance, the Greek myths are famous, and countless books have been written about their meanings, but none of them are true. The real meanings of the Greek myths were never revealed to the public. This is equally true of every religion in the world. Every myth and religious story is symbolic and has levels of hidden meanings. In this series, we will only introduce this subject. It is impossible to include all of the legends and myths from our many traditions, or to go deep into the details of many billions of years of history. Here, we are only going to show that there is much for us to learn. Those who wish to dive deeper into this subject will find a very reliable guide in The Secret Doctrine by H.P. Blavatsky. This incredible book from 1888 laid the foundation for the development of the 20th century. It awakened the West to the universal shared root of all spiritual knowledge. It was also the bedside reader for perhaps the most important scientific mind of recent centuries, Albert Einstein. Everything we will briefly outline here is fully documented in The Secret Doctrine and was expanded upon in the 20th century by Samael Aun-Weor.
Modern science insists upon the doctrine of evolution. So do human reason and the secret doctrine. And the idea is corroborated by the ancient legends and myths, and even by the Bible itself, when it is read between the lines.
Modern science has theorized a timeline of evolution based on bits and pieces of physical evidence. Yet most of our history did not occur in physical matter. Evolution does not begin or end in the physical world. In fact, the physical world is simply an outer shell, a thin skin. It is the most superficial aspect of evolution. Life emerges from far deeper. The tree of life symbolizes the laws of nature and has many levels of meaning. It is the secret basis of the Western religions. For the purpose of this explanation, we can view it as layers of density. Existence emerges out of a primordial abstract space and gradually condenses as matter, energy, and consciousness in layers of increasing density, what we can call dimensions. That unfolding occurs in cycles. It expands outward, evolves a bit, and then retreats. It is like our breath or heartbeat. It emerges, then retreats. This cycle repeats and repeats in timescales that are truly incomprehensible. With each expansion, it reaches further. Over vast ages, layers of nature gradually become more dense until eventually the physical world crystallizes. Here and now, there are many levels of nature that are more subtle than the physical level, but we don't perceive them with our physical senses. We can experience some of those levels dimly when we dream. But unfortunately, we dream without cognizance. We are not aware of those worlds, even though we exist in them here and now. In our current condition, we are limited to our physical senses, which reveal only the outer shell or surface of much deeper events that emerge from the more subtle levels of nature. To help us understand that, we can observe a person and see their expression, but we cannot perceive the cause. That expression on their physical body is a result of what is happening inside of them, their thoughts, emotions, and inner sensations. Our physical senses cannot see those levels of nature. Everything we perceive in the physical world is a result of what has already happened in the internal worlds, in the subtle levels of nature. That is why we can dream about things that happen later. Everything in the physical world was in the subtle worlds first. This includes our human race. Our evolution began in the internal worlds. We are not the first human race on this planet. We will not be the last. Before us, there were 4 great civilizations. Our oldest scriptures symbolize our ancestors differently in each tradition. But once you know the clues, you can see that they all tell the same story. Billions of years ago, there was a race in the subtle levels of nature who had formless bodies made of light. Because of residual karma from previous eras, those beings had to descend into lower forms. They began to inhabit bodies of form. Billions of years ago, when the Earth was still in formation, the subtle forms in the internal dimensions were slowly crystallizing into the physical level.
And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the soul of the Elohim of the first era moved upon the face of the waters.
Our mythologies describe primordial titans, great gods and goddesses of ancient times. Those myths, such as Avalon and the Tuath Dé, represent the ancient race of Polaris. Their lands were remembered as Tul, Tula, Aztlan, Avalon, Asgard, and many other names.
This sacred land is the only one whose destiny it is to last from the beginning to the end. It is the cradle of the first man and the dwelling of the last divine mortal.
Today, the physical part of those lands is under the northern ice. The polar race was semi-ethereal, semi-physical. They were very beautiful, with a rich black color, and did not have gender or race. They were filled with virtues, wisdom, and intelligence. Their bodies were colossal, but subtle, amorphous, somewhat like an amoeba or a cell. In the Abhidharma scriptures of Buddhism, they are described as having bodies of light that are not limited by the laws of the physical world. They could stretch or constrict themselves at will. Their purpose was to lay the foundations for life on this world and to guide it for billions of years. In the ancient scriptures, they have many names and symbolic representations. The Indian scriptures call them Prajapatis, the self-born. In the Bible, they are called Elohim. The first root race was a divine humanity, a race of gods. They still exist today, but in a subtle level of nature. The polar race did not have gender. They were androgynous, male-female. And reproduced by vociferous asexual reproduction. They simply divided their body to make a new one. Just as cells today have no gender and reproduce asexually by splitting, that is how our ancient ancestors reproduced, and it is how our body first begins. The ancient myths of the creator gods represent the polar race. From deep within the subtle levels of nature, they have been guiding the evolution of life on this planet for billions of years. So when the moment was right, they made terrific efforts to perform great feats of creation, to initiate a new cycle of evolution, a new race of human beings. Over millions of years of evolution, the Elohim guided the development of a new race in a slightly more dense form. We call them the Hyperboreans. The physical part of some of their lands still exists today in northern Europe and Asia. The Hyperboreans were smaller than the polar race, but still enormous compared to us. Their bodies were a little more dense than the polar race, but were still not fully physical. In the Bible, this is represented by another level of light.
And the Elohim of the first era said, "Let there be light," and there was light.
They were also androgynous, male-female in one being, but could manifest as male or female as necessary. The Hyperboreans reproduced by budding, by sprouting a new body on themselves. Over many millions of years, the Hyperboreans evolved and devolved. Their civilization had stages, just as each day does: dawn, midday, sunset, and midnight. These are the 4 ages: the Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. The 4 stages in the life of anything. The stages of evolution and devolution. In their Iron Age, some of the Hyperboreans began to devolve and show signs of self-interest, selfishness. Over the course of millions of years, this self-interest caused some of the Hyperboreans to degenerate further and further. They began to show qualities of the lower kingdoms of nature, the animals. Eventually, they devolved into forms similar to primates, and that devolution has continued to this day. The physical bodies of modern-day primates are devolved forms that began back in the Hyperborean era. And those old bones of animalistic humans that scientists have said are our ancestors are actually the remnants of degenerated Hyperboreans. At the end of the Hyperborean era, there was violence and darkness. The Hyperborean race was destroyed by hurricanes. A select group of them was taken out to lay the foundation for a new era of development.
And the Elohim of the first era said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear."
The continent Lemuria, or Mu, was the first dry land on Earth. This was when the physical level was fully crystallized. In the Bible, it is called Eden. That ancient continent was in the Pacific Ocean. Remnants of that civilization can be found all around the Pacific, like Easter Island and Australia. The Lemurians were smaller than the Hyperboreans, but giants compared to us. The average lifespan of the Lemurians was 1,500 years. They spoke face to face with the gods, the Elohim. The Lemurians could see all the dimensions of nature. They knew their purpose and their future. They had no pain in death or in birth. After 150,000 years of evolution, the Lemurians reached a degree of civilization that we today are still very far from reaching. They had flying ships and boats propelled by atomic energy. They used nuclear energy. They had cosmic ships that allowed them to travel to other worlds.
And the Elohim of the first era said, "Let us make mankind in our image, after our likeness." So the androgynous Elohim created a new race through evolution in their own androgynous image. In the image of Elohim created they them. They created them male, female.
The first Lemurians were hermaphrodites. A hermaphrodite has both male and female sexual organs and reproduces the species asexually, alone, by fecundating one egg with one sperm. Then, over millions of years of evolution, the Elohim guided the division of the sexes. Through gradual evolution, Lemurian children began to be born with one sexual organ more accentuated than the other. That became more and more common, until finally children were born with a clear gender as a man or a woman. This did not happen from one day to the next. The division of sexes took millions of years. The separation of Adam and Eve in the Bible symbolizes the division into sexes that happened in the Lemurian era. That is recapitulated in the development of every fetus today. At first, the fetus has no gender. Then there is a moment when the fetus evolves to be either male or female. This is why the males of today have inert nipples. This is why the females of today have a clitoris, which is an atrophied penis. Our physical bodies today have remnants of our ancient past, when human beings were hermaphrodites. Obviously, once the sexes were divided, sexual cooperation was required in order to reproduce the species. Menstruation remained in the feminine sex, but the egg was unfertilized. It was necessary to have the cooperation of the masculine sex to fertilize the egg in order to reproduce the species. All of this was in accordance with the designs of the Elohim. At first, the sexual cooperation of male and female was a sacred event only for reproduction that was only performed at special times of year and only at the temples under the guidance of the Elohim. That is the origin of the tradition of the honeymoon, a special trip for the married couple to initiate reproduction. Back then, the sexual act was an act of prayer, and there was no lust or orgasm. The couple would unite sexually in the temples and remain that way, focused in prayer and meditation. The Elohim would guide a single sperm from the male to the egg in the female's body. The Lemurians practice immaculate conception, reproduction without orgasm. So, as you can see, from race to race, over billions of years, sexual reproduction evolved. The polar race evolved to reproduce by fissiparous asexual generation, by splitting. The Hyperboreans evolved to reproduce by asexual budding. The Lemurians evolved from gemmation at first, reproduction by means of an egg, and then reproduction by sexual cooperation. Throughout these root races, for billions of years, humanity evolved with sexual purity and was approaching a critical step, the opportunity to become Elohim themselves, gods and goddesses. For the evolution of humanity to advance further, the Elohim needed the Lemurians to fully crystallize in the physical world. Their physical bodies were ready, but their consciousness was not fully enveloped in their physical bodies. They were so devoted to divinity and so pure, so innocent, that they did not want to go into the physical world. They could only hazily perceive the physical world. In a sense, their perception was like the opposite of ours. We only perceive the internal worlds dimly, such as in dreams. For them, it was the opposite. The physical world was dim. It was perceptible, but not interesting. They loved the light of divinity that they saw with their superior senses. They wanted to see divinity, not the physical world. So they were at a kind of boundary between the subtle world of the fourth dimension and the concrete world of the physical dimension, and they did not want to continue their development into the physical world. So, the Elohim guided the evolution of the Lemurian bodies to develop a special organ, to attract the consciousness towards the sensations of physicality. In esotericism, that organ is called Kunda buffer. It was at the bottom of the spinal column and formed a tail. This event is mirrored in our development as an embryo. For a brief time, the human embryo has a tail. That is a recapitulation of our ancient past. With the tail in place, the Lemurians definitively turned their attention towards physicality. And over millions of years, their consciousness became fully secured into the physical bodies, and therefore the physical world. Once that tail was no longer necessary, the Elohim guided nature to devolve it away, and over time it was dropped from the physical bodies of the Lemurians. We still have a vestige of it at the base of our spinal column. It is called the coccyx. Unfortunately, that tail was attached for a little too long. It left a shadow in our psyche, fascination with physical sensations. In the Western scriptures, Adam and Eve symbolize the Lemurian humanity. The myth says that Eve was tempted by a serpent to eat a forbidden fruit, the fruit of the tree of knowledge.
Of the tree of the knowledge of Tov, purity, and Ra, impurity, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die.
The tree of knowledge is also symbolic. Its true meaning is hinted at throughout the scriptures.
And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain. And the angel said unto her, Thou shalt conceive in thy womb, and bring forth a son, and shalt call his name Yeshua, Saviour. Then said Mary unto the angel, How shall this be, seeing I have not known a man?
The Hebrew word da'at implies sexual knowledge. Unfortunately, the scriptures about this were translated poorly to enforce the dogmatic philosophy taught to the public about so-called good and evil. The mythological, symbolic tree of knowledge hides secret teachings about sex. Tob means pure, good, ethical, sweet. Ra means pollution, impurity, wickedness. These are the polarities of sexual action and the potential results of sex. There is a pure, ethical form of sexual cooperation, and there is an impure, polluted form of sex. The pure form can create an Elohim, a Buddha, a master. The impure form creates devils, monsters, pain, and suffering. This is what was hidden because knowledge is power, and sexual knowledge is very dangerous. Over billions of years, our ancestors evolved to reach sexual cooperation, and were being prepared by the Elohim to utilize sex in a pure way based on genuine love, to develop their consciousness so humanity could become Elohim and enter the superior kingdoms of nature. But the Lemurians were tempted by pleasure. While away from the temples, the males, longing for union with the females, tempted them with their symbolic serpents, their sexual organs. And the women, tasting that pleasure, wanted more. It is obvious that the story of Adam and Eve is symbolic, and it is obvious that it is about sex, but humanity has never understood it. Now you will. The temptation of Adam and Eve symbolizes all of the ancient Lemurians who began to have the sexual act away from the temples. They were tempted by their own minds and by pleasure, and eventually they discovered the orgasm. The orgasm happens when the body is overcharged with sexual power and cannot control it. The orgasm is a short circuit that expels all of the accumulated power. The orgasm is symbolized by the forbidden fruit. It is forbidden because the sexual power creates life, both externally and spiritually. The sexual power is the fuel for the consciousness, the living waters that create eternal life. That is why serious practitioners in all religions preserve their sexual power. When you eat the forbidden fruit, you waste your sexual power, rather than using it for its intended purpose, the development of the human soul. When the sexual power is expelled, lost through the orgasm, the consciousness is weakened. Through the orgasm, the Lemurians expelled the sexual power that gave them their beauty, spiritual powers, and purity. So they degenerated. Tempted by desire for pleasure, that ancient humanity polluted the sexual act. Rather than the tree of knowledge leading to good, purity, it led to pollution, impurity. Before that mistake, they were pure, happy, and innocent, and they knew divinity face to face. After polluting the sexual act with the orgasm, they discovered shame, fear, and discontentment. They lost sight of divinity. They discovered pain, the feeling of being disconnected from divinity and disconnected from others. Eden, happiness, was lost. In the myth of Adam and Eve, when they were expelled from Eden, this represents how the Lemurian humanity entered fully into the physical world. This was supposed to happen anyway, but while retaining consciousness of the internal worlds. The problem was they ate of the forbidden fruit. So instead of entering the physical world consciously, the Lemurians entered through indulgence in desire, with the consequences that result from it: suffering, pain, and unconsciousness. The Lemurians lost the ability to see the superior dimensions, They lost the ability to see the gods, the Elohim. They lost their beauty and innocence, and instead fully crystallized into the physical world, fallen, expelled from paradise. This also occurred over a long period of time. It was not from one day to the next. Subsequently, because they had lost their powers, they sought to recover them by selfish means. They began to use their rituals and spiritual knowledge selfishly, which turns it into black magic. In the last days of Lemuria, black magic spread everywhere. The Lemurians devolved into warring tribes, and in their pride and anger, they unleashed atomic weapons on each other. For 10,000 years, earthquakes destroyed the continent of Lemuria and threw it all to the bottom of the ocean. Today, only a few traces remain. At the last moment, a select group of Lemurians were taken out to be the seeds for the development of a new era. The Elohim fought valiantly to plant those seeds and made great sacrifices for them to rise higher. But the consequences of the fall from Eden could not be avoided. And so the cycle of evolution and devolution began again. The Atlantean humanity was the next great civilization in ancient times, still millions of years ago. In the beginning, in their golden age, the civilization of Atlantis was beautiful. Law and ethics were respected as sacred. Love and sex were considered sacred and holy, and the sexual act was only performed for the reproduction of the species. The Atlanteans also had technology far more advanced than ours. They traveled to other planets. They combined science with spiritual power. They knew how to place the consciousness of living things into humanoid android robots to serve them. They knew how to degravitate anything, making it easy to move even enormous objects. They had beautiful religions. All of the religious teachings of the Inca, Maya, Aztecs, Greeks, Phoenicians, Scandinavians, and the Hindus all have Atlantean origins. The gods and goddesses of those traditions were the heroes, kings, and queens of Atlantis. The Atlanteans reached the highest point of civilization, culture, and knowledge in our history. Then, at the peak crisis necessary for the development of humankind, the Atlanteans had to face the temptation of the tree of knowledge. The Atlanteans were tempted by the forbidden fruit, and most failed. Then humanity branched into two opposed paths, the pure and the impure. The pure preserved their sexual power. They rejected the orgasm in order to gain something better, spiritual fire and the strengthening of their consciousness. The impure encouraged the orgasm. They sought pleasure and power, and their influence spread rapidly. As a result, the devolution of the Atlanteans accelerated. Sex became a tool for pleasure and power. The Atlanteans had orgies they mixed sex with magic and developed a taste for lust, pride, anger, and envy. The physical bodies of the Atlanteans were smaller than the Lemurians and did not live as long. Where the Lemurians lived from 1200 to 1500 years, the Atlanteans lived only 600 to 700 years. To extend the beauty and the lifespans of the rich and powerful, the Atlanteans began to harvest glands and hormones from the poor. They transplanted hearts, kidneys, and even brains. As a result, an Atlantean could remain alive for many centuries beyond their normal lifespan and through many bodies without interruption. Their senses were also less powerful than the Lemurians, and over the course of time, because of the many abuses they were pursuing, their perception worsened. They lost sight of the superior worlds and lost sight of the gods, and their pride and desire to recover their spiritual powers. They revived the black magic of the past and developed it to become more powerful. In short, the Atlanteans devolved much further than the Lemurians.
And God saw that the wrath of mankind was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of their hearts was only wrath continually.
Those on the pure path warned them that the end of their civilization was approaching, but the Atlanteans laughed and mocked them. In their Iron Age, the Atlanteans devolved into a series of wars so profound they are still remembered today in the Mahabharata. This series of wars lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, and it led to the use of atomic weapons, which triggered huge earthquakes. The first was 800,000 years ago. The second was 200,000 years ago. The third and the last, the one that finished Atlantis for good, happened about 11,000 years ago. And it triggered a flood that totally sank the remnants of the Atlantean civilization. At that last moment, a select group of Atlanteans from the pure path were taken out, exactly as it happened with the previous races. Cultures all over the world remember that event in the stories of Noah, Vaivasvata, Utnapishtim, Deucalion, and hundreds more. Stories that symbolize how a handful of pure Atlanteans escaped to prepare for the creation of the next civilization, us, our modern humanity.